Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining our last panel discussion for today on climate contribution claims. My name is Nicole. I work as a project officer for Plan Vivo, primarily with the Ekos program, and I'll be moderating this panel discussion. So in today's session, we are excited to explore new routes for corporate climate action and look into alternative options beyond traditional carbon offsets. Let's start by introducing the problem and opportunity that we're here to address. So many projects are currently unable to issue carbon offsets. This is because of evolving regulatory reasons, but we also see that the market for voluntary climate action by companies is currently undergoing a notable transformation. Where the focus might have been on achieving carbon neutrality, companies are now looking for alternatives. So there's an opportunity here to offer clear guidance and differentiate between offsets and contributions, allowing companies to communicate their impact more transparently and build credibility and trust in their climate efforts. Next slide. To clarify, carbon offsets allow companies to compensate for their emissions by purchasing carbon credits generated from projects that reduce or remove greenhouse gases, with a primary focus on achieving or claim carbon neutrality. On the other hand, climate contributions involve direct financial support for regenerative activities, such as restoration or adaptation projects, without claiming specific emission reductions. And these contributions aims to support broader sustainability goals, such as biodiversity or social co-benefits, rather than only focusing on offsetting emissions. Next slide. Recent research done by Climate Partner has explored three different models that we can see here. So we have the ton per ton approach, which this model involves companies making climate contributions directly based on the volume of their emissions. So it's a very straightforward way to keep a clear connection between what a company emits and how it contributes. And this can bring clarity in communication, since it's a very similar to the traditional offsetting model. But because of that, it could also raise some skepticism about its real impact. The money per money approach is instead linking contributions to emissions. So companies commit a certain amount of money for each ton of CO2. For example, they might pledge $30 per ton of CO2. This gives companies the flexibility to support a wide range of projects, including biodiversity or community development. The challenge here is ensuring that the use of funds is credible and transparent, and that the ultimate impact is clear to all stakeholders involved. And finally, we have the money for money approach. And in this model, companies make a contribution based on a specific percentage of their annual revenue or profit, let's say 1%. And this approach differs from the other two, as it doesn't tie contributions directly to emissions, but rather to the company's financial success. So why are these new approaches needed? In my opinion, I think they tackle some of the key challenges that we see in the VCM today, such as greenwashing or the risk of double counting. They also allow for greater reach and impact, moving beyond just carbon reduction and removal, and can provide early funding for some projects. Next slide. But let's hear now from our different perspectives, and let me introduce you to our panelists. So joining us today from Plan Vivo is our CEO, Keith, who you probably have heard in some earlier sessions today or yesterday. And he will start the panel with some context and research done by Plan Vivo. Joining us from New Zealand, we have Sean. Sean is the Chief Executive and founder of Ekos. He is an international expert in market-based mechanisms for environmental and climate financing, specializing in restorative and environmental forestry. And he's bringing to the table the buyer's perspective. Also joining this discussion is Miro. He's a co-founder of Climate Lab, which started in 2016 with the Plan Vivo certified EcoTrees project. And by today, they already have 4 additional projects located in Mozambique, Madagascar, Bolivia, and Cameroon. And last but not least, we have our Plan Vivo Latin project coordinator, Helena, who's joining us from Mexico. She has many years of experience in the VCM, and especially from a project and market perspective. So thank you all for joining this panel, and now over to you, please.
Thanks, Nikki. And nice to be on again with everybody. So if you could go to the next slide, please. As Nikki said, we're going to start off with a little bit of context from the point of view of the standard. So this idea of climate contributions, one key thing for us as a standard is how would this sit alongside our current credits within Plan Vivo? So this is a table you may have seen in some of the other presentations about the difference between our future PVCs, reported PVCs, and verified PVCs. Again, we can talk a bit more about what they are, but FPVCs and RPVCs are meant as ways to bring upfront finance in to allocate PVCs to buyers before they've been verified. So they have different functions and different properties of what you can and can't do with them within a registry system. So this table just summarizes that. So only verified PVCs can be used for offset claims, but FPVCs and RPVCs can be converted later on after verification and then used for offset claims. Climate contributions would not be. So I think that's a big distinction to make up front. We would have to make them very clear that these cannot be used for offset claims. However, the feedback we got from our research, which I'll come on to on the next slide, suggests that there's still a need to issue these units on a registry. So they would all be issued on a registry like any other unit. They could also be allocated to a buyer, and that's one of the reasons for having them on a registry. But they also, apart from not being used for offsets, they would not be retirable, again, like a future PVC. And they would also not be convertible. So a project would have to decide up front that these credits or contributions are not been used. They can't change their mind later and decide to use them for a offset claim. Next slide, please. So in trying to understand this issue a bit more, we did a little bit of market research with some of the projects we work with, including Miro on this call, and also some of the market actors that we work with. And thanks to all of those who fed into that discussion. So we looked at different options. One option was, well, do we really need a new unit type? Would that cause confusion with the different mechanisms we already have, which we were covering on the last slide? I think the general feeling was we don't want to create a new unit type, but we still wanted to see how it fits alongside them. There's a question over whether they really need to be issued on a registry or whether they could be issued on a more informal registry. And again, it was felt in terms of integrity that it would be better if they were also issued on Plan Vivo's registry, which is hosted by S&P Global. There was a question of if these credits weren't issued, that there could be some kind of perception that they're of lower value, even if they've gone through the same certification process, so that they wanted to be issued. And again, looking at if this is a new metric, how might that impact what projects have to do in terms of the methodology and in terms of what to do to go through that full certification process. So where we kind of got to was towards this idea of a label or an attribute where essentially projects would follow the same process as they would do under the Plan Vivo standard V5, but they would just label them differently. So they would still have to follow a full V&V process. They would still have to have credits on the registry, but the only difference is they wouldn't retire those or use them for offsets. Next slide, please. So before we move on to the other perspectives from the point of view of projects, from the point of view of the market, from the point of view of potentially a country perspective, we had some strategic considerations that I think are worth putting out there, and maybe we can touch upon again when we get to the discussion. So, a big question, which still really isn't answered yet for us, is there does seem to be interest in this idea for climate contributions. Other people in the VCM talk about it, and particularly around this kind of non-offset or non-greenwashing approach. It seems like another way to frame a very similar climate impact. But how big is that market? We're not really sure yet. And yeah, so understanding how big it is, what the demand is, and what they want is still something I think we're learning about. And linked to that, does this distinction, does a climate contribution framing make it more attractive for some corporates, especially corporates worried about being criticized for greenwashing, or some corporates who are already offsetting and they want to use these climate contributions to show that they're going beyond offsetting? Again, some of the buyers in our network already do similar approaches like that. Also, could it help countries or projects in countries legislation that doesn't support offsets and official carbon markets? So, could that be a way to contribute for a corporate outside that country or within that country to make a contribution to that project, measuring climate contributions but not using them as an offset? Does that help? Or could it be used as a mechanism to link to national contributions and NDCs? Again, some interesting discussions across our network about whether that could be a use for these type of credits or credits. And I guess a key point at the end, again, maybe we'll touch on in the discussion, is if we're framing these certificates as climate contributions, does that have an impact on the price? And would that price be similar to PVCs that are eligible to be used for offsets? Again, this is a question over the market demand and how much the market is willing to pay and value these. So I'll stop there and we'll go around the other panel members to hear the different perspectives and come back in the discussion. Thank you.
Do you want to start and bring in your perspective to the panel?
Sure, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for that introduction, Keith and Nicole. You both presented a really good overview of the issues, and yeah, the Ekos, we're working in this space both as a project coordinator, project developer of projects, as well as a retailer of these products certainly in the New Zealand market for carbon-related claims. And the introduction that you both presented is confirmed by our experience around concern about greenwashing, an element of confusion in the market about really what net zero actually means, confusion around the role of any voluntary action with respect to whether it contributes to a nationally determined contribution in any way. There's also confusion around what is a legitimate action and what is just a greenwash. It's led a lot of, or some corporates at least, to, and not just corporates, any business, any private sector entity that wants to do the right thing, there's a high risk that as soon as they tell somebody that they're doing something positive, that they end up becoming a target for what I'm describing as brand vandals who make the assumption that you're crooked until proven otherwise, even if you've been through a rigorous process. And this just creates a whole lot of brand risk for companies that would otherwise want to make a contribution to looking after the planet in a voluntary capacity. One of the things that we've been doing in response to this is on the demand side, delivering clients the opportunity to make non-absolute claims, so contribution claim types. Because in New Zealand, for example, there are two carbon claim certifiers, two main carbon claim certifiers. One is a government-owned program, and the other one is us at Ekos. And we offer net zero certification options, but we also offer a certification that doesn't use the word net zero. One of them is carbon conscious. Another one is climate positive. Another one is impact positive. And these non-absolute claims are providing our business clients, and not only businesses, schools and local government entities, the opportunity to make positive contributions without asserting that it's net zero. This provides quite a lot of flexibility because it allows, it steers away from that one-to-one relationship between a ton of CO2 emitted and a ton of CO2 offset. But one of the integrity gaps that we've noticed in the global carbon market and the voluntary market, especially with respect to offsets, is the price that is paid for those offsets and the price that might be paid for a contribution. Because if that price is relatively trivial, then one could assert that it's heading down the path of greenwashing. And I think this is one of the reasons why many very large companies that have purchased large numbers of very cheap carbon credits for like US $1 each or US $2 each are being labeled as buying get out of jail free cards. And I believe there's an element of truth in that, because they're not properly pricing their emissions. Like, their emissions have a real cost on society, and that's called the social cost of carbon, the external cost of carbon pollution. And if you're going to compensate for that by offsetting, certainly there is a ton for each ton emitted that's offset, but if you're purchasing them at really low prices, there's no incentive really, or very small incentive, to continue to genuinely reduce your emissions, because there's not a big financial burden on your company. And we think that's a big problem in the voluntary market broadly, because it creates what we think is carbon price leakage, and it steers buyers away from high quality projects like Plan Vivo projects that need certain floor prices in order just to break even. And so what we've done in our own certification program is put a floor price in, so that our carbon buyers are not allowed to purchase really cheap carbon credits. They've got to pay a minimum price that aligns with the social cost of their pollution. Now, this helps to steer our buyers in one or two directions. Direction one, buy high quality carbon credits as offsets, and pay appropriate prices for that, for absolute claims. Option two, purchase contribution units, but priced at that social cost of carbon. And so in Nicole's three options, the middle option, money for ton, it's the step of properly pricing your emissions and then paying a price, paying that price. And what that does is that price, when it's appropriate, it creates a financial incentive to keep reducing your emissions, so that you can avoid having to spend so much on those contributions. But it also opens up the door to well-priced contributions rather than very cheap units. The thing is, though, the other thing that we're doing is creating an instrument to produce non-carbon units that initially will focus on biodiversity, and we've already started with this, but in future will broaden out into any of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And this is called the Ekos SD program, which will launch in the near future, where the contributions on the supply side are measured, reported, and verified UN SDG delivery and transparently priced at cost. In order to align the pricing of the units to the price points in the market in a ton a ton for money option, there are various ways of doing that, but it's first worth mentioning that there's no sort of base price for looking after the planet or looking after people, because every project's going to be different. If you've got a project that's going to maybe rescue a species from extinction, that will be quite differently priced to a project that might be focused on gender equality in a rural community somewhere. And so what we've done is, instead of trying to lock in a certain price, we're locking in transparently pricing those projects. And then we can reverse engineer the size of the units to match the price point that aligns with the social cost of carbon. So, for example, if your hectare of habitat you're protecting is going to cost $1,000 per hectare per year to protect, well, you can divide that hectare into smaller pieces and a size that aligns with, say, $30 per piece, so that you can sell that at a price that's linked to the social cost of carbon. So that's the way we're exploring doing it. It's early days. It's a new market, and we're testing demand as well. Some of the questions that Keith raised about, what is the level of demand for this? Yeah, it is an unknown for all of us. But what we also know is that, the financing gap to deliver the UN Sustainable Development Goals is estimated to be about $4.5 trillion. And the private sector is absolutely needed to fund this. And one way to do that is to present them with high quality, community-based projects that contribute to environment, social and governance reporting, ESG reporting, and nature-based financial disclosure reporting, of which carbon is part of that puzzle. So I think and I hope that we're at an early stage of a new sort of era in these markets, and we're very keen to participate in that with high quality systems that are additional, measured, reported and verified. We've built a registry, issuing units. The units are retired at end use, so they can't be double sold. All of those safeguards are built in to provide a sort of an integrity for this. So I'll just hand over there and look forward to the next speaker. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, very interesting to hear that Ekos is exploring some alternatives for companies to, what claims they can use. Carbon conscious, I liked a lot. Miro, please, the stage is yours to also share a little bit from the project perspective here.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, of course. Happy to share some reflections on contributions from the project perspective, or maybe it's better to say our perspective, because we are just one project, of course. I think we can agree that over the last year, there have been rising conversation, rising demand about what is called high quality, high integrity credits. And if you put it in perspective, one could say it brings us back to the origin of the voluntary carbon market. If I'm not mistaken, I read somewhere that the world's first voluntary carbon credits were born out of a desire to help smallholders in Chiapas, Mexico, to plant trees, and these were Plan Vivo credits. So you could say from the start, the Plan Vivo project are designed to provide triple benefits: benefits for nature, benefits for climate, benefits for people. And the idea of integrity has been embedded in the holistic Plan Vivo design, and it has been so from the early beginning. For example, when other standards have developed what they call co-benefit add-on labels, to talk about co-benefits. But co-benefits are just in the core of a Plan Vivo project, and we refer to them as the core benefits, just to make a difference between how Plan Vivo standards is different from other standards. Or even other standard projects, they have to sometimes use ratings to show that they are integrity, that they are qualitative projects. But within Plan Vivo project, Plan Vivo is the rating. All Plan Vivo projects have integrity and quality as a shared strength. That's also why we love the Plan Vivo model. It's also why I think everybody that's listening now and participating in the sessions kind of loves the model. Generally, I would say the shift towards high integrity carbon credits, of course, very positive. I was also happy to hear in the opening session of the stakeholder meeting that Plan Vivo has submitted for ICVCM CCP approval. Of course, with the note that it's only applicable for VPVCs, but still it's kind of pushing the trend towards high integrity. We hope also that high integrity could steer the voluntary carbon market in the right direction. And with the right direction, we mean that it could deliver sustainable development impact that goes beyond carbon credits, beyond carbon sequestration. And in doing, like it's already proven by all the Plan Vivo projects, there is a potential to strengthen rural smallholder communities in the front line of climate change. So, and maybe you could also say it's a possibility to push out the carbon cowboys that were mentioned in the previous presentation. So one could say if we support it by responsible buyers, and then I think very important also long-term commitments, PVC are just very great path for successful climate action with benefits for nature, for climate, and for people. And in reality, you could say that perfect path is perfect, but it's not always the case. Sometimes it's restricted. With the Paris Agreement, many countries started to draft complex carbon legislations. Some countries opted to opt out of the carbon market and go for the non-market approach. And as you know, if you don't have government authorization, it's not possible to pursue with market PVCs that can be used for offset purposes. But how then is the question, of course, and it's to my feeling still an open question throughout the presentations. If you don't get a carbon credit, but you get a contribution unit, how can we convince responsible organizations to pay a fair price for those contributions? So we basically wonder how can Plan Vivo projects access long-term commitments and importantly also annual reinvestment, because a project needs annual reinvestment to succeed, and this within a context of contributions. You could argue that basically the PVC, the Plan Vivo certificate, is a holistic design, so that makes it also flexible, because it's always been about more than carbon. And like mentioned, there is an opportunity there. Some responsible companies want to kind of squeeze out of the greenwashing circus that is out there, and maybe there is an opportunity to reach out to them and to have contributions. It can be carbon, it can be broader, it can be SDGs, or so on. But then the question is, from a project perspective, I would say, what exactly do these companies want? How do we have to put them in touch with our unit, our contribution unit? Or maybe to put it a bit differently, what is the best alternative for a carbon credit with offset characteristics? When we first started thinking about it, we thought like, okay, let's call them trees, because everybody knows a tree. A tree is a very tangible ecosystem product, you could say, and it's why not call them Plan Vivo certified trees and try to go to the market and sell those? But as we all know, trees, if you go to the market, it's quite competitive. Can be by some trees very, very cheap. So you don't get a fair price, and especially not the price that you need to run a Plan Vivo project. So the other option is, of course, to stay close with the Plan Vivo market infrastructure that is there, to have the PVCs with a contribution label. I would even say, why not make it retirable as a retirable unit, to really put it in parallel with the existing infrastructure. And also, if you go to the market, sometimes I have the feeling that lots of companies are addicted to retirements. And to go to the reality, the Plan Vivo model works. For example, we have started the polytrees project in Bolivia. We are now on the path to the Plan Vivo certification this year. It's generally following the same principles that we use and we successfully apply in Ethiopia with the Ethiopia project. But of course, it's a different context, and not only a different environmental, social context, but also a different landscape. And here I quote the Bolivian government that they are against participating in carbon offsetting programs where actors from developed countries pay for emission reductions in the global south, which they see as the commercialization of Mother Earth and its environmental functions. So, to put it short, the Bolivian context carbon credits cannot be used with offset purposes, or at least they are not compliant with the law of Mother Earth, the law of Pachamama. But if we go to our project, because that's kind of the perspective I can give, we work close with smallholder farmers in two catchment communities, Yanarumi and Tunasani, just a bit south of Cochabamba, Bolivia. These communities, they want to make a shift from shifting cultivation that is causing decreasing soil fertility, land degradation, and they want to switch to agroforestry practices with diversified crop products, improved soil fertility, improved agricultural productivity. But to do that switch, you need a joint effort, but also a long-term effort. You need a stepwise process to introduce endemic forest species, irrigation infrastructure, food species, agriculture activities, and so on. And to do that step-by-step process, you have to be able to strongly rely on annual community reinvestments. Just want to emphasize this because it's very important from the project perspective that you have an annual reinvestment. Our ambition with the project is to strengthen the ecosystem, to create sustainable income alternatives for the communities, and that those are directly derived from the ecosystem, so that you create a win-win for the ecosystem and the socio-economic livelihoods. And that's simply by tapping into the non-timber forest products, medicinal plants, fruits, and honey. So what I'm trying to say in a nutshell is everybody wants high integrity credits. All Plan Vivo projects have integrity at the center. The community-led Plan Vivo model works, but some Plan Vivo projects cannot have market PVCs with an offset option. However, all projects, and that means also the contribution projects, need fair and annual community reinvestment to succeed. So what is my question in this session in exploring the new paths? We wonder whether a Plan Vivo credit with contribution label is attractive for the market, and who is then the perfect buyer? Or maybe contribution PVCs are not the way forward, and then we are very eager to learn how you see the future for PVCs in countries where offsets are not allowed. And with that final questions for the panelists, but also for the listeners, I want to end and happy to learn your ideas and answers.
Thank you, Miro. And thanks also for sharing your positive experience with Plan Vivo. Lastly, super interested to hear Helena's perspective and your experience from the market perspective. So, you?
Well, coming from the hi, Nicole. Thanks for all to be here. I want to give like wide picture of what is going on with the markets and what is going on with the governments and how we can explore different routes according to nationally determined contributions and to many other systems that are in place right now. For example, these NDCs, as we call it, NDCs in the shorter way, has been a real milestone in terms of global climate goals, the achievement of having all the countries aligned into putting climate goals into the picture, but also the conversation with Article 6 and with all the mechanisms that are needed to put in place has been very complicated, complex. Abatement strategies have not come that easily as many were expecting because you have a lot of implications into these discussions and what they are going to create in order to comply with all these climate goals. So we also need to understand that abatement costs and opportunities will come in a different way, depending on the region, depending on the countries. So to have a clear picture of all these differences and the outcomes expected in terms of NDC targets and achievements, we can see that we will have different scenarios to understand to give alternative solutions. So many countries have been working until now with different carbon instruments like emission trading systems, voluntary carbon systems, or markets, carbon taxes, emission subsidies. They can come from a national or subnational level, but depending on the interconnection that they have, they can be very powerful tools to comply with climate targets and to boost the investment that obviously we all participating in this scenario. We are looking into that. We are looking for investments. So on the other hand, this can be very complicated to design. So we need a lot of space for analysis and to understand either policies and these market instruments, how they are working, how they are right now in place, and what we can be given to the picture. What we also know is that the climate change impacts all around the world are in a constant urgency of having different solutions and different commitments from all parties involved. Until now, we haven't seen that strong commitment from many of these parties. Maybe it is coming from this side of not understanding all the complexities that are going on. So we need to have more alternatives that can bring solutions in the short term to comply with the climate goals. So now, coming from the governments have the responsibility to set the rules on how these carbon models can or cannot be applied in their territories. So these instruments can contribute to NDCs or to their climate targets. So having all these wide parties instruments in place, police decision makers need to have relevant information, can help them understand all the possibilities that these different models can bring into the picture. Our responsibility as Plan Vivo, like in the standard, is to contribute to a global agenda and to the conversation as a carbon party involved in the development of projects that are being designed in the global south under climate vulnerability. Now, with the creation of the climate and biodiversity standards, we're committed to work alongside with the governments to show the holistic models and to see how we can design landscape sustainable approaches that can bring reforestation, restoration, and conservation work, but also can bring biodiversity, blue and green carbon certifications. In that matter, Plan Vivo has a focus on working with the smallholders, local communities, indigenous peoples, and people living in spaces with natural resources, but they are the centerpiece of the design of the sustainable economical, social, or environmental opportunities coming from community-led projects. So if we want to set long-term commitments for emission reductions and removals, we need to put them in the center of the conversations. Since we are having these problems with climate change and they are coming from anthropogenic activities, we need to see that the more that we support people living in these regions, the best that we can find solutions to climate change impacts. So to understand the climate contributions models, we can see it as an alternative route to offsetting. We are opening a new door to commitments that are going into climate action. So we need to set a scenario that is attractive to all parties involved in. With the climate contribution model, we can start a conversation that goes beyond carbon benefits and really pictures the people into the center of the conversation. For example, in Latin America, we have a potential for emission reductions and removals coming from projects due to the richness of the region. Many of these countries are already exploring the carbon markets, some with more openness, some more skeptical. They don't really rely in carbon markets, so they don't like carbon market approaches. So they're looking into different alternatives for financing models and to achieve climate goals. So the climate contribution model could be a good route to explore going to have a work with these governments. Plan Vivo has been working actively with different governments from the region. Plan Vivo has been introducing the holistic model, exchanging relevant information with the governments and helping them understand what can bring Plan Vivo bring into the picture coming from the market side. So we have signed memorandums of understanding with the government of Mexico and Panama. We are currently working to put in place one with the government of Ecuador. So each of these countries are designing their own cap and trade models in accordance to their constitution or to the policies that they have in the countries. And they are deciding like which is the best route they can take in accordance to carbon market opportunities and what would they be expecting for them. In some cases, they want to move away from the carbon market approach. Miro kind of talk about this into more committed model that talks about contributing to nature. So having these conversations with policy makers has been very useful for them and for us as a standard to understand the relevance of having a common agenda that can help countries achieve their climate goals. Some of these conversations have been going into understanding what is a carbon accounting, regulatory compliances, transparency mechanisms, benefit sharing models, communities engagements, reporting to authorities, third-party verification, national registries, or reporting of sales. But most of all, they're interested in understanding who are the buyers or the investors. So this is part of the key conversation to have with the governments to understand which are the alternative routes that they may have to finance their activities they are looking for. So in the case of Panama, for example, we have been having training sessions with the government representatives. They wanted to understand how the blue carbon model works and how it can be applied at the country level. And they are also analyzing possible scenarios for projects that would be suitable in different places in Panama. In the case of Mexico, we have been having conversations with at a country level, not only us, also the other standards present in the region. And we're looking at the government is creating a new set of rules to have more guidance into the national carbon market. And they have been having several conversations with us as a standard to understand the components and to see which things would need to be adjusted to make it easy the compliance and to be in accordance to the national carbon market. And finally, we have been having conversations with Ecuador. They have a constitution that guards certain rights to nature. So they are adjusting carbon practices on their own national views and needs. So they are looking for units that can represent contribution to nature. And as well, they are putting all these characteristics in the context of the national market in Ecuador. So we have been having conversations with the government in the process of validation of the standard and for them to understand what we can bring into the picture. So as you can see, we have a wide way to discuss all these scenarios that are going on in the governments and with the market, but we need to find a common solution that can help boost investment to the projects that are already bringing solutions in mitigation to climate change.
Super. Thank you so much, Helena. I think it was really interesting also to hear some examples from Mexico and Ecuador and how these countries are going forward. Well, in general, I think it was already super interesting and insightful from the different perspectives. If the audience has any questions, just a reminder again, please pop them in so that the panel can discuss them. Maybe I'll start with a more general question because it was also discussed already by Miro and by Helena, the question of who are these buyers and what do they want? And maybe this is a good question to give to Sean, since you really have a lot of experience with the buyers. So What challenges do you face in communicating the value of climate contributions to the buyers? So what are they looking for? And maybe also from your experience, who are these buyers? What is their incentive to buy these non-absolute contributions?
Thanks for the question. What we're finding is some buyers are so tired of the controversy around net zero claims that they just want to get on with doing something good without putting up a big red rag to a bull and attracting criticism that they really have no interest in attracting, because they just want to do something valuable. And this includes private companies, it includes local government entities. For example, we work with local government entities in New Zealand, and one of them said to us, look, we don't want to do net zero. We just want to help look after our region. We want to measure and reduce our carbon footprint, and instead of offsetting with carbon credits, we'd really like to help biodiversity in our neighbourhood, in our region, around, so that our own communities can benefit from this spending. And so we're working with one council to do exactly that. And this is where contribution units are, they're valuable because, and if they're not carbon credits, if they're biodiversity or other forms of contributions, climate resilience, the general public knows that we need climate resilience. That's and it's in desperate need of additional funding. And so I think the risk of claiming that you're contributing to climate resilience, I think that's a much lower risk than to claim that you're net zero, because net zero is kind of, it's a virtue signaling. It's sort of beating your chest and claiming to somehow be, or at least there's an interpretation by some stakeholders that the assertion is that you're not having an impact on the climate system. And so that's perhaps one reason why there's many, criticisms of net zero claims. But when you're not making a grandiose claim, you're making a more humble claim, there's less risk, and you can still build momentum, and you're still reducing your emissions. So that's one example. I think one of the main areas of this is de-risking that communication. Just saying, hey, look, we're just trying to do the right thing. And that's what we're finding.
Yes, thank you. Another question, Helena, for you probably. You already mentioned in your presentation earlier that a lot of project developers are looking into alternative financing models. Maybe you can give a few examples that communities and countries are exploring instead of carbon offsets.
Okay, in the case of Ecuador, for example, they are exploring a route that is designed into not upsetting or not actually upsetting. It is a carbon market. It has certain characteristics like the carbon market. One example is that they need to negotiate with an end buyer. You don't have middle people there because this is coming from their own vision of how they see the market. So they are exploring how to integrate these tools that have been useful in the market, but also creating like a more ethical approach or a quality approach that really puts in the center all the beneficiaries that are going to come in the chain. It is not only the vision from the market, it's also coming the vision from the participants and for the region and even for the governments in terms of what they can achieve with the presence of the carbon markets. So this is a route that is being explored with governments like Ecuador. Ecuador and Bolivia guard the same idea coming from a concept Quechua that is related into putting in the center of the conversation nature and rather to commercialize it as an item. So this is a different perspective that is being designed and approached. And we need to keep our eyes open on what are these opportunities and what alternatives we can bring into the picture, so the investment can go with the best tools that we have in the carbon markets and can be adapted to the needs of these governments and these national visions.
Thank you for this. A question maybe to Miro, since financing is obviously a big topic. You mentioned it already. Projects need annual financing, long-term financing. How do you see the introduction of climate contributions impact the ability to finance and implement projects?
Can you please reword the last sentence?
Sure. How do you see the introduction of climate contributions impact the ability to finance and implement projects?
I would say it comes both with an opportunity and a risk, because somehow, like I tried to mention, there is an opportunity space. There, but at the same time, there is also a risk if you go further away from the core, what is in PV climates now carbon. You have the three pillars, but everything is kind of traded from the carbon perspective. So I feel if you go far away from that core, it becomes also a risk because it becomes more vague and it's more difficult to find somebody who is interested in buying your unit at that moment. So I do believe it's important to stay how it is currently designed, following the architecture that is there, the PVC with the contribution tag. I think that's still the smartest path forward. And also it's kind of safeguards that your unit has been validated, it's a Plan Vivo unit, it's verified and so on. So it's really strictly attached to the current PV climate. But I think that's a good thing. If you take it back to the very first presentation from Nicole, where you showed the three ways forward, the ton for ton, the money for ton, and the money for money approach, I would say I'm somehow afraid to go to the money approach and fully go that way. I think it's important to have a kind of a blend where somehow ton for ton is still there, because it creates also a market, it creates demand. It should not be purely ton for ton, because I do believe that is maybe the old system. It creates a push towards low integrity credits. We don't want to go that way. We want to go away from that. But it does give an incentive. And I think it's not maybe ideal to go forward and to say ton for ton is out. I think it's still important to kind of take it in, take it forward, because it gives a framework, it gives a perspective, it gives an incentive, it creates demand, and demand is important. I still am afraid that in the current market situation, there is a need for, we'd say, more awareness to the process from going away from carbon to really going, you could say, to contributions. But I fear, from the perspective of project developer, that that market is still quite an unknown terrain, and that it's not yet clear. Do you get the same price, or do you get a fair price for a project that follows all the same protocol? And I think, I don't know how the future should look like, but I do think it comes with an opportunity because it's more flexible. You can have like the holistic design of Plan Vivo, and you can have all these actors and can have value for them. But at the same time, it comes with a risk because it's maybe an unknown terrain with not really a framework yet where demand is being driven through. I don't know if that answers your questions at all, but it's a bit how I reflect to it.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's also interesting to see the perspective from you with these different approaches that we showed in the beginning, and what are the potential drawbacks here as well. So thanks for that. One follow-up question, actually, for Helena, to go back from Patricio, is with the Ecuador government, how could an understanding about climate contribution, the constitutional ban, or the commercialization of environmental services?
I'm sorry, Nicole, can you repeat the question? I didn't hear the entire question.
Referring to the Ecuador government, the example that you were giving earlier, how could the understanding of climate contributions affect the constitutional ban or the commercialization of environmental services?
Well, this is something from what I was saying into having these conversations with the governments. Usually we have this gap of information of them understanding what the carbon standard is bringing and what the public policies are going on in each country and how they can be matched with a joint work. So it is really relevant before talking about labels to have these conversations with the governments and to understand what they are trying to achieve and to see how you can create a bridge or how can you collaborate from the part that you are doing and from the information that you're bringing into the picture into creating a system that can comply with those systems that they are creating on their own way and their own vision. In terms of NDCs, we are all adding up. We are looking into adding into NDC compliance. So what we need to do is we need to find these routes that can open these conversations and can help understand all the parties involved on how to have a common agenda. It is like Miro is saying, is we have a lot of things to analyze, to see. We have different scenarios to understand, and we don't have all the answers yet. We are exploring them. 20 years ago, we were exploring Kyoto Protocol, and we didn't have all the answers. And all along the time, we started creating some solutions and we started creating some routes. Some had some mistakes, some were working pretty well. So we are in that path with Paris Agreement, and we are trying to follow up which has been the best practices that have been going on for all these years that can be applied or need to be adapted according to these different systems.
Thank you. I think we have maybe a little bit of time for one more question for Keith, I would say. How should a carbon standard such as Plan Vivo distinguish between climate contributions and traditional offsets in their frameworks? And do we need any new criteria or processes for this?
Thanks, Nikki. Good question. I mean, I think one thing which strikes me from this conversation is there's a commonality here about high integrity. These, and that being everyone was talking about core benefits beyond carbon. So I think one of the key things is how this is framed against what else we're doing. That this is an alternative route, but it's not a lesser quality, lesser integrity route. If anything, it's more about high integrity because the focus is not just on carbon, or at least from a market perspective, it's less than just on carbon. So I think that's an important thing to think about of how we frame it. I think Miro did mention about the risks, and I think there is a risk. There's a risk if you are creating two routes where one route is seen as a let's say an easier route and is almost could be devalued by the market as being cheaper, because it's a different route. So I think there is that risk. So I like the approach of saying this is essentially the same process, but all you're doing is looking at almost like a different use case. And it may well be that the way the whole voluntary carbon market is going is that the discussion is moving away from offsets. And we might actually be a little bit ahead of the curve here in some of these discussions, because what we're talking about here, people who buy Plan Vivo certificates already are not the people who are doing the minimum they need to do. to do their offsets, right? These are people who are responsible buyers. As Sean mentioned, these are people who want to do good stuff. They're not just buying cheap energy credits. They're doing more. They want to have, as you said, Miro, core benefits, not as like an add-on, nice tick in the box. These are core. This is what they want to do it for. And I think having more of that conversation when we talk about integrity of climate contributions or offsets is about that bigger holistic integrity of the process and what we're doing. So actually, I think it fits quite well with what we're already doing in Plan Vivo, and maybe it's of the comms, the marketing, the framing of it, rather than really changing the process very much.
Yes, very nice. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think to wrap it up, since we are now a little bit over already the time, I think we all can agree that we need to move away a little bit and give alternatives from only focusing on carbon and looking at these holistic models. And it was great to hear these different perspectives and really seeing that there is the need, the demand is there, but a lot of questions still need to be answered and we need some guidance here. So thank you all for tuning in and listening to this interesting discussion. And also thank you to all our panelists for giving your perspective and sharing your insights. And have a good evening.